Hi everyone, I'm Victoria Sampson. Welcome back after what was a delicious lunch. Thank you for your participation. Our session today is going to be talking about space security and stability. We have a great lineup of speakers. Hey, if you guys aren't done talking, could you go outside, please? Thank you. All right, so we have a great lineup of speakers. Their bios are all on the website, so I ask you to look at that for more information about the backgrounds. We're just going to go down the line, starting with Ali Stickings. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. Thank you for the opportunity to speak here today. My name is Ali Stickings. I'm the Research Fellow for Space Policy and Security at the Royal United Services Institute in the UK, which is a defence and security think tank. So I was asked to talk about emerging counter-space capabilities. But I think also to understand what these capabilities are, we need to look at them within the context of how and why they might be used. It's very easy to look at space as something separate, a separate domain that needs to be thought about differently and within the framework really of those who understand it. But we all know the importance of space for terrestrial matters, and this is seen in no better way than through looking at the military. Militaries use space for navigation, precision bombing, secure communications, and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, to name just a few. Space can be described as the connective tissue, enabling operations in the three terrestrial warfighting domains of land, sea, and air. And this is really the key point I want to make. We need to understand the military perspective, particularly because counter-space capabilities will be developed and carried out by armed forces. So why might a military use counter-space capabilities? For them, assuring their uninterrupted access to their space assets is key, as is their ability to deny that access to their adversaries. And this is an important point. It's not necessarily about destroying or disabling satellites for the sake of it. It is about denying and disrupting the information from those satellites. In terms of specific capabilities, despite recent events, I think we are going to see a continued move away from kinetic ASATs. And there are two reasons for this. The first is that it does require a certain technical capability and also the financial means. And the second is that we are seeing a lot more happening in what is known as sub-threshold or gray zone warfare. It's not overt conflict. It's something that's going on, beneath that level where countries would necessarily retaliate against an action. And so also in this, where militaries will not look at using platforms that are overtly weapons. And there are a few of these that I'll focus on. So the first is jamming and spoofing, particularly as related to global navigation satellite systems such as GPS. Using jamming, by preventing the signal getting to the receiver, you can effectively blind users and stop them from carrying out certain operations. For example, they can't navigate. They can't safely drop weapons where they have and they'll have a much less ability to mitigate and minimize collateral damage. And spoofing is perhaps even more worrying. And this involves interfering with the signal and replacing it. And if done well, the user will not know that the signal they are getting is false. So imagine a scenario of a warship, and it thinks it's in international waters, when in fact it is in the terrestrial waters of an adversary. You can imagine what would potentially happen from that. And these are areas where the Russians in particular are very proficient. And I think, as many people know, you can buy small, limited GPS jammers on Amazon. These are capabilities that will become more and more available to more actors. Both jamming and spoofing work against ground receivers. And so I think it's really interesting when we think about the term counterspace and looking at it as referring to the denial of access to information from space rather than just against the assets themselves. The second area is those capabilities that prevent a satellite from collecting or transmitting information. This includes using lasers to dazzle optical sensors and the use of high-powered microwave frequencies that can interfere with circuitry. China has been developing such capabilities, and again, I want you to consider a scenario where tensions are rising in the South China Sea. and something's happening between China and Taiwan. The ability for China to be able to deny, for example, US satellite coverage, even for a limited time period like a day, would have huge implications. I think the use of cyber will also grow, particularly against ground stations and systems that control satellites. Of course, ground stations are also at risk from more traditional forms of attack. And again, these are open to many more actors. You don't have to be a space actor to be able to have an effect against these systems. Emerging counter-space capabilities so are likely to include those that are more accessible to these non-traditional actors, and we need to understand what their motivations might be. As long as space is providing a military strategic advantage to a state, its assets will be at risk of disruption or denial. And we're having all these conversations about weapons in space and the peaceful uses of space, but we need to ensure that throughout all those conversations, we're also taking into account that military perspective.
Thank you, Ali. Okay, so moving down the line, we have Chandrasekhar Srinivasan, and I see you have, okay, you'll be speaking from the podium.
How do you do? Forward that one. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for this opportunity to be here. This is the second time I'm coming to speak. Last time I was talking about what's happening in space and what should India's approach be, or an Indian strategy for taking care of its own security interests in the larger context of what's happening in the international world, international arena. So I was largely focusing on what India should do in order to protect itself. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about what the Chinese are doing and how the US-China rivalry is going to play out, and what kinds of implications that would have on our country and on the region around us. Okay, so this is really more about what China and the US are doing to each other in space and how does it affect all of us. Last time I spoke about a new series of Yaghan L-INT satellites that China had launched. They have currently about 12 of these satellites in 3 different orbital planes. And the reason why they have these 12 satellites is to monitor the region between 35 degrees north and 35 degrees south on a near continuous basis. Just to give you an idea of the space component of this constellation, let me give you a little bit of technical detail. These are the three orbital planes. They are separated by about 120 degrees. So as the Earth rotates, right, parts of it will come under surveillance by one constellation, and then it will be followed by the second constellation in the second orbital plane, and then the third constellation in the third orbital plane. This L-INT constellation kind of complements the other constellation that the Chinese have built. These are triangular Yaghan satellites located in a 1,200-kilometer orbit at an inclination of 63.4 degrees, very specifically. So these are triangulation satellites that locate the position of electronic emission sources on the surface of the land and the sea and anywhere else. Okay, so these are really the first set of electronic intelligence satellites that the Chinese had launched. These two complement each other to provide continuous coverage or surveillance over given parts of the world. I will elaborate a little bit about and tell you what exactly. So these are the focus areas. So it covers most of the key security concerns of China. Taiwan, somebody talked about it just now. All the seas, the South China Sea, the North China Sea, the Korean Peninsula, covers the US base at Guam, Japan, of course. So you can call it a kind of theater-level L-INT constellation. So constant visibility over the region between 35 degree north and 35 degrees south seems to be a part of this effort. We have a small software package that we have developed in order for us to enable to look at coverage patterns of different constellations of satellites over different parts of the world. Now, this is a package that is somewhat like to understand what's happening in space and what specific countries are trying to do in space. So we did what I call a propagation exercise, where we used the NORAD two-line elements of the orbits of all the Yaghan LN satellites. There are about 3 constellations in the 1200 kilometer orbit, which is 9 satellites, and about 12 satellites in the lower 600 kilometer orbit, making a total of 12 plus 9, 21 satellites, okay? And we looked at the coverage pattern over Taiwan. We took Taiwan as a test case. We looked at it for a period of 24 hours. And in this particular slide, you can see that we've looked at the total time interval, the coverage time, the number of gaps, the duration of the gap, the cumulative coverage, the cumulative gap, maximum gap in minutes, minimum gap in minutes, and we come up with a measure of efficiency. Please look at the last line, which says 79% for a 24-hour period. So it effectively means that for 80% of the time, emissions emanating from Taiwan would be visible, right, to a Chinese satellite constellation. Okay, so that is the first part. Now, when we look at the detail of this particular coverage exercise, you find there is a lot of redundancy in the coverage. So if the Chinese are able to optimize the coverage pattern a little bit, they can actually improve this efficiency from 79%, maybe increase it to a little bit over 80%. Okay, so that is another part. And the third part I would like to emphasize is that does not take into account that these satellites can be used to queue the SAR satellites and the optical satellites that the Chinese have already established, and therefore the coverage pattern can be even more, can be even better. Okay, so that is the other part I would like to emphasize. So, I mean, this is a typical snapshot for a 100-minute visibility. You can see the number of satellites are likely to pass over the critical part of Taiwan, okay? So, which means effectively that electronic coverage of most of the area between 35 degree north and 35 degree south, right? It's almost under constant electronic surveillance by a Chinese constellation of LN satellites. That is the key message that I would like to point. Now, these satellites can then be used as a part of a queue to look at the what I would call the SAR and the electro-optical satellites that complement the electronic coverage to provide what is called ISR capabilities over the region. I'll just give you a snapshot. I don't have enough time to talk too much about all of them, but this gives you a snapshot of all the civilian and military satellites in the remote sensing. On the y-axis, you have the altitude, so you have different altitudes, and along the x-axis, you have the time period, and you see each one of the satellites are outlined. This covers only the period up to 2016, but 2018, 17 and 18 are also significant additions. So some of them may have been replacements and some of them may have been new. You can see there are a very large number of remote sensing and Yaghan satellites, which are military dedicated satellites for the ISR coverage. So between the LN's coverage and the ISR coverage that they're talking about, you have a significant coverage, C4 ISR coverage of major vulnerabilities associated with China. Okay. So last time I had presented the same slide. I had mentioned that there was one area where the Chinese may not have had any capability, that was early warning. They have recently launched 3 satellites called the TJS-1, TJS-2, and TJS-3, which seem to be early warning ballistic missile warning satellites in geostationary orbit. The other thing I would like to point out is they also have very precision-oriented missiles. So China is today a comprehensive space-based military power, and space is a very major enabler of its precision strike capabilities. If you look at the platforms, I'm talking about the DF-21 anti-ship ballistic missile. We're looking at the ASAT. We are also looking at a number of short-range and medium-range missiles which are directly targeting Taiwan, a major area of concern. And I'll talk a little bit at the end about the organizational capability that they have, but put together, they have a very strong space capability, and space, therefore, is a very important enabler of its precision strike missile force, which is looking at a whole range of possible scenarios, not only for war, but most probably for the deterrence of war. So this presents a picture as of November 2018, which compares all the, so there are a total of about 1957 working satellites around November 2018. The US, of course, is the largest player, but you can see that 849 US satellites, China has 284 operational satellites. But if you look at the military component of both countries, they are almost on par. I think the US has about 175 and China has about 164. So they are more or less competing with each other on the space military side, and I'll talk a little bit about why, okay, and what's the purpose of that competition. This is just a network diagram that looks at China's larger neighborhood. I won't go into detail. It provides a way in which we can look at the land threats that China is likely to face, okay. I'm just getting through that, sorry. Jesus Christ, I think it's taking time. Okay, this is just a ranking of all the threats. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4 will come up. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. And if you look at the maritime neighborhood, again, we can identify a lot of threats. The Korean Peninsula, Taiwan, and the Indochina, 3 major concerns. The South China Sea, the East China Sea, and all the seas coming towards China. These are other areas. And we can look at a number of relationships. I'm not going to go too much into this. I don't have the time. I think I'm already likely to, sorry. Okay. So the basic idea that I'm trying to point out is most of the space-based deployment is really looking to get information beyond the first island chain. The first island chain and the second island chain. You must remember that China has faced most of the threats before the emergence of the People's Republic of China from the seas. The first Opium War and the 100 years of humiliation started and continued to be a major problem, and all those problems came up from the sea. And therefore, China is really worried about its core, defense of its core, mainly from threats from the sea, okay? And the notion of the first island chain and the second island chain is really about trying to make sure where the enemy can be held and where they can be deterred. So these notions of geography are therefore pretty important even when we look at the space part. I don't have time to go into it, but we can elaborate a lot about it in case anybody is interested. So I again talked about this in the last presentation. Space is now a very critical component of war, okay? Now, with the end of the World War, with the end of the Second World War, nuclear weapons and conventional weapons became closely coupled. When Sputnik was launched, it provided 2 things. One is it brought space in as a new dimension of warfare. And the other thing it brought in was the ICBM that launched Sputnik could also do very precise targeting. I talked about it earlier. So that's the other thing that it was very capable of doing. So all these 3 components, therefore, are kind of connected together in today. So we can no longer look at war as a nuclear war or a conventional war or a space war or as a cyber war. All of it is connected, and cyber is one thing that connects all of them together, okay? So there are many, so if you're looking at deterrence, we are looking at multiple deterrences or connected deterrences. It gets to be very complicated even to understand conceptually what it is about. But one thing is very clear. China is very clear that space is going to be an important component of its future, not only military, but what it perceives as its national power. Okay, I'll finish, don't worry. The other thing that I would like to make is that conventional missiles is now dominating the Chinese arsenal mix. So nuclear, which used to be a very important priority earlier, has now become fundamentally focused on conventional. And most of the missiles they have are short-range and short-range missiles. There is this DF-21 missile, which is both nuclear-tipped and non-nuclear-tipped. So in the area between the first island chain and the second island chain, there is a lot of nuclear ambiguity brought in by the use of these missiles, which adds to the deterrence of this capability. Okay, so these just give you the ranges. These are the nuclear missiles. These are the short-range non-nuclear missiles. These are the deployment of total Chinese forces. So not only do you need precision missiles and space capabilities, you also need a lot of other things. So these are the deployment of various military forces in the southern theater of China. So the other thing I'd like to make is the PLA is reorganizing itself. So it's got now theater commands breaking the Army, Navy, Air Force dominance. It is now a theater that commands all the requirements in each individual domain. And they also set up the strategic support force, which is responsible for space, cyber, and electronic warfare. It cuts across all the theaters, and therefore it's like a key information glue that holds the whole thing together. Just to give you an idea, Chinese satellites have grown like hell in the last 10 years. Last year, China launched 39 times. US launched only 34 times. China has about 106 satellites last year. Okay. So it is definitely very, very clear that Chinese think of space as a very important component of their strategy. I talked about this. This tells you relative positions. I think the China-US competition, China is getting closer to the US in terms of all space capabilities, including the military capabilities. And finally, I just have to say that China sees space power as very important. If you go back and look at the history from Mao's time, political prestige was associated with the launch of the first satellite. It soon became dominant. The military part became dominant. Under Deng, economic power became important, and then it reversed a lot to the military part. Today, China is also interested in pushing the knowledge dimension of space. They launched the world's first quantum satellite. They also launched the first satellite that used X-ray pulsars for timing, kind of. So they are looking at space not only for the military part, which I talked about, also for the softer part. So state power, hard and soft. And therefore, China and space and comprehensive national power is very closely connected. And that's what I have to say. Thank you. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Jean-Jacques. Next, we'll have Colonel Bath, who also will be doing a presentation at the podium.
I shall be covering China's military space organizations, strategy, and reforms. The launch of mankind's first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1, by the Soviet Union in 1957 spurred China to develop its own space capabilities. Mao adopted Project 581 in 1958 with the intention of placing a satellite in space. In 1967, Zhao and Lai remastered the Chinese Academy of Sciences under PLA control. This very step was a landmark in China's space journey, as all its space ventures hereafter had a military flavor. China launched its first satellite, Dongfeng Hong, that is, the East is Red, and became the first nation to attain this capability. Became the fifth nation to attain this capability. I shall be covering my talk under three heads: China's space organizations, both civil and military, China's military space strategy, and the reforms being implemented in space organizations post the creation of PLA Strategic Support Force. Coming to China's space organizations. Now, these are post-reforms. These are the pre-reform organizations. Strategic affairs are controlled by three principal organs in China. These are the State Council, PLA, and the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party. These three organs control a number of organizations related to space which have interlinking functions. In order to coordinate decision-making on sensitive issues, China usually forms a leading small group which harmonizes a coherent view amongst the three organs. While it is difficult to delineate the civil and military verticals of China's space organizations due to their cross-linkages, I shall attempt to broadly cover them separately. The civil vertical is headed by the State Council. It is the highest government body and is responsible for acceptance and funding of space projects. Subordinate to the State Council are three agencies: the Ministry of Science and Technology, Chinese Academy of Sciences, and the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology. The Ministry of Science and Technology is responsible for the formulation of national research and development strategy and for sponsoring niche technology projects. The Chinese Academy of Sciences is the governing body for all space science and remote sensing establishments. The Ministry of Industry and Information Technology regulates industrial planning, policy, and standards. Subordinate to the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology is the State Administration on Science, Technology, and Industry, or the SASTIND. It is the administrative body for the defense and aerospace industry. It is under it that Chinese National Space Agency CNSA and the Chinese Aerospace Corporation CAC, they function. CNSA is responsible for the enforcement of policies and regulations on space activities and for undertaking international collaboration and technology exchange programs. CAC controls the aerospace industry. CAC has two components: the Chinese Aerospace Science and Industry Corporation, or CASIC, and the Chinese Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation, or CASC. CASIC is a defense development agency and a conglomerate of 140 companies engaged in the development of missiles and aerospace equipment. CASC is a conglomerate of 130 companies engaged in the fabrication of satellites and launch vehicles. These 130 companies under CASC are grouped under 8 academies, each dealing with specialized aerospace products. Chinese commercial space ventures are dealt by China Great Wall Industrial Corporation. The military vertical under PLA comprises the General Staff Department and the General Armaments Department. General Staff Department is responsible for planning, training, mobilization, and operations of PLA. It is the consumer of space products. Its space role encompasses the tasking of remote sensing, navigation, and also communication satellites. It has under it the Satellite Navigation Office for management of Beidou satellite navigation system. The General Armaments Department is responsible for research and development, production and procurement of defense equipment, and administering China's space program. China's Satellite Launch and Tracking Control, or CLTC, functions under the General Armaments Department. CLTC controls the launch centers and telemetry tracking and control centers. Direct ascent kinetic kill missiles and mobile launchers are held by the 2nd Artillery. China's space strategy has evolved over the years, from peaceful utilization to military utilization of space. In 2002, China's Defense White Paper stated, at present, the outer space is faced with the danger of weaponization and protection of outer space from weaponization, and an arms race has become a very urgent and realistic issue. In 2004, Hu Jintao laid down the new historic missions for PLA, which included space security as one of its missions. In 2006, just prior to the ASAT test, the Science of Campaigns in its new edition stated, the space domain daily is becoming a vital battle space. Space has already become the new strategic high ground. The white paper Space Activities in 2006 identified that the aims of China's space activities were national security, protection of her rights, and building up comprehensive national strength. Even the Chinese ASAT test in 2007 was justified by China as a mere response to US withdrawal from the ABM Treaty. The Defense White Paper 2015 for the first time designated space as a military domain. In 2016, the White Paper, China's Activities in Space, laid down that China's space vision was to build into a space power in all respects and reliably guarantee national security. It is evident that China's space strategy has gradually evolved with the realization that dominance in space shall prove vital to winning wars under informationized conditions. With its thirst towards aligning PLA doctrines to winning informationized wars, China has started according high priority to space for conduct of military operations. China's use of space manifests in its strategies pertaining to anti-access area denial or A2AD, counter-space program, ballistic missile defense, and regional power projection. A2AD refers to restricting the adversary's access to key locations identified as strategic by China. The execution of A2AD strategy calls for information superiority. Space-based C4ISR and navigation assets form the backbone of executing the A2AD strategy. The 8 pillars of A2AD include cyber operations, information operations, long-range precision strikes, surface and undersea operations, ballistic missile defense, space and counter-space operations, air defense, and air operations. And the success of each one of these is linked to space. The counter-space program of China is another facilitator to its A2AD strategy. With a capability to disrupt or destroy adversary satellites, PLA can reduce their effectiveness in the identified strategic location by degrading the information dominance of the adversary. Thus, China's counter-space program will have major ramifications in the planning and conduct of its informationized wars. Another employment of China's space-based assets is in the development of ballistic missile defense capability. China has launched the Gaofen and the Shijian series of satellites, some of which have infrared payloads meant specifically for detecting the launch of ballistic missiles. Such satellites will prove to be the eyes and ears of China's ballistic missile defense program. China's space strategy is also related to regional power projection. In the realm of soft power, China has used its space assets to monitor and conduct humanitarian assistance and disaster relief programs in South Asian countries. It has also employed the Gaofen and the Hyang series of satellites in counter-piracy operations and securing sea lanes of communication. Even China's Belt and Road Initiative will have linkages to space, with vehicle tracking and transshipment being controlled through satellites. This soft power is often complemented with hard power when Chinese frigates frequent the disputed Senkaku Islands or blockade the approach to Scarborough Shoal. With the phenomenal growth in naval capabilities, PLA Navy, assisted by space assets, is increasing its maritime footprint in littoral South Asian countries. Now, the creation of PLA Strategic Support Force and reforms in space organizations. In December 2015, PLA commenced its 11th major reorganization. Driven by its military space strategy, China sanctioned the formation of PLA Strategic Support Force for integration of strategic capabilities by the merger of space, cyber, and electronic warfare verticals, and thus functioning as a nodal agency for the conduct of informationized wars. Strategic Support Force is envisaged to have two major organizations: the Space Systems Department, responsible for conducting space operations, and the Network Systems Department, responsible for cyber and electronic warfare operations. The space-related functions of the General Staff Department and the General Armaments Department are likely to be transferred to the Space Systems Department. Therefore, satellite launch and control centers would be brought under the Strategic Support Force. No concrete evidence exists as to whether direct ascent kinetic kill units and mobile satellite launchers of Second Artillery have been subordinated to the Strategic Support Force. The likely purpose of Strategic Support Force is to launch and manage China's space-based C4ISR sensors. It will be primarily staffed by Army personnel, but is expected to support the operations of the three services. While announcing its raising, President Xi Jinping had urged for civil-military integration, which is indicative of the likely involvement of scientists and space experts in the functioning of strategic support force. To conclude, China's rapid growth and success in space is attributable to political patronage and national vision. The Chinese strategic thought envisions that the commanding height of strategic competition would be in space. The creation of strategic support force indicates that space would be further integrated into PLA's concept of warfighting through the development of enabling capabilities, doctrines, and training. Therefore, PLA is moving steadily to meet the essential elements of winning informationized wars. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel Bath. And then last, we have Jean-Jacques Tortora.
Thank you, Victoria. So I'm Jean-Jacques Tortora, so I'm director of the European Space Policy Institute based in Vienna, and the SP is a unique of its kind think tank fully dedicated to space policy-related issues. And today I will try to, I would say, to elaborate a bit on the status of Europe regarding security in outer space. Europe is I would say most often not regarded as a major player when it comes to space security, and in many respects, I think that this is the reality, especially when we consider the Europe-wide organizations. We have a few. One of them is the European Space Agency, which has been pretty active in space debris mitigation for its own activities, but also in I would say developing capacities for SSA and space debris monitoring, but not beyond that. The European Union on its side has never been really mandated by its member states, although it is hosting the current SSA, European SSA program, which actually is developing in the framework of a consortium of member states, which is an intergovernmental organization under the umbrella of the EU, a bit complex institutional framework, actually. But however, EU has also been at the, I would say, the originator of this code of conduct, which has been mentioned earlier today. And although it was ill-fated, I think it tells a lot on the European mindset regarding space security. European member states on their side are quite active. France prominently, which has been the trailblazer in Europe for the development of SST capacities, and which is expected to shortly issue a highly expected space defense policy. We have Germany, which is also acting on par, and both of them having taken this initiative of setting up a consortium to pool resources to build up a Europe-wide SST-SSA program. And the other member states are increasingly interested in or sensitive to space security issues. And the consortium, for instance, is rapidly growing and welcoming a higher number of member states. Now, we are at the moment at a turning point there, because the situation is pretty different, and the paradigm is changing, and the game changer for Europe is actually the full deployment of Galileo and Copernicus, and now EU as the owner and the operator of these major constellations that are both of them quite critical from an economic perspective, has now been given a responsibility in taking care of the responsibility of these assets. And the first step there is what I would call a growing sensitivity and a growing interest for space traffic management, which is the next step beyond SSA, which is I would say in progress at the moment. So what we mean in Europe regarding space traffic management, I will not enter into the detail, but it's a generalized approach to collision avoidance And it comes along with a number of challenges. First, the issue and the objective is obviously to set up an operational service. I will come back to this issue of operational. But first, I would say that the first challenge that we need to address is the issue of the precision. If we want to really make collision avoidance, if we want to avoid having too many alerts, if we want to be able to specify accurate collision avoidance maneuvers, we must really dramatically increase the precision of the assessment of the orbits of the various objects up there, and increasing the precision. We have two options. The first one is to increase the precision of the instruments that measure the position of the objects. The other one is to multiply the measurements and measuring the same objects when they fly over different geographical regions is probably the easiest way forward. And this is why I would say in Europe we mostly expect space traffic management to come up as a broad collaboration to allow for maybe not crowdsourcing, but multiple sourcing of data, and in the framework of a broad international cooperation. And of course, as such, an international cooperation there comes along itself with a number of challenges. The first one is to set up an adequate data policy. We know that within these data, there are a number of sensitive data, and segregation of the sensitive against the non-sensitive data is probably I would say a major step forward, which will not be easy to address. Next is also, if we multiply the number of sources of information, the next issue is to ensure the integrity of the data, ensure that data is not on purpose or not, polluted by wrong or false information. This is also a major issue which will have to be addressed. And last but not least, if the point is to come up with an operational service, definitely we must anticipate on the role that the private sector might play there. The US, through the Space Directive number 3, they have clearly stated that the commercial sector should play an active role there. And I would say that Europe is probably on the same line here. First, because the point is to I would say offer a service to be delivered on a non-restricted basis, and also because this service should be proposed at effective economic conditions. And for all these reasons, I would say the private actors are most likely to be the most effective. But at the same time, one thing that is quite clear is that we should avoid the creation and the setting up of monopolies, because then we will not have, I would say, significantly progressed as compared to the current situation. Now, I guess that space security is not just about space traffic management. There are also a number of issues related to what was extensively discussed this morning, the prevention of arms race in outer space. Actually, there are at the moment two philosophies that are at work when it comes to ensuring the security of national assets in space. We have a first set of nations which believe that international regulations are the way to go in order to ensure the safety of operations in orbit. And definitely Europe is pretty much on this line, and this initiative related to the code of conduct is probably the best illustration of this mindset, I would say. But we also have a number of other countries which would absolutely not rely on any kind of international regulation to ensure the security of their space assets, and which definitely believe that only their strengths and national or technological advance is likely to ensure such protection. And in this perspective, they privilege their liberty of action in outer space in order to keep all the options open to actively protect their assets. And I think that well, in this category we will find most of the big players. I will be happy to hear where India positions itself there. But I would say that this opposition of philosophies, I guess, is not likely to change in the future. And I think that this has been rightly put forward this morning by Jessica in particular. The borders the borders between the military and civil are getting increasingly blurred, and the peaceful, we tend to oppose peaceful and non-peaceful use of space, but there again, we see that it's becoming increasingly difficult to separate or to segregate both activities, and probably taking advantage of the ambiguity of the current international legal regime. I think that these borders are, I believe, will get increasingly blurred. So, what is likely to happen is that more and more players will get closer to the so-called red line, because there is a red line which is written nowhere, but this is a red line that at the moment everybody is very careful not passing. And I would like to conclude at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jean-Jacques. We have about 20 minutes for questions. I'd like to start off by asking the first question. We've heard a lot about China's military space strategy and their thinking in terms of how they want to use space to enable their national security apparatus. But we have not heard about India's military thinking on space and how India intends to use it as an enabler for its national security apparatus. I'd be curious to hear if the panel has any thoughts on that and where the recent ASAT test fits in their national security strategy. Don't. Okay.
I have to confess, I've been out of the government for a very long time. I've been out of ISRO for an even longer time. So you'll have to bear with me if I kind of speculate a little bit. I think there is no question that given the fact that the Chinese space program and the military connotations of the space program, there has to be a significant enhancement of Indian military space capabilities. I tend to believe that is inevitable given the current geopolitical context in which India finds itself. Whether the priorities that whether the Indian approach is the appropriate approach or whether it could be different is another question. But I don't think there is any ambiguity that we have a large number of assets, and protection of those assets, I think, are inevitable. Given that consideration, I would like to make the other side of the story. If the international regime moves forward, and I think that prospect, I've been following the CD things from 1982. I am a long veteran of a lot of this talk on military space. And we actually believed in the 80s and 90s that it was possible that we would actually have a kind of continuation of the sanctuary regime of the Cold War. I tend to believe all that is gone by the wayside. Space is already a weaponized environment, and therefore countries have to protect themselves. I see only one scenario in which maybe things can work out. If the US on the one hand and Russia and China on the other hand can get together and decide that enough is enough and that we want a streamlined set of rules and regulations that can follow, I think it would work very well. But I don't think the political prospects of such a thing is likely. And I therefore believe that the spillover of this US-China rivalry or US-China-Russia rivalry is going to have consequences for all the countries, especially China's neighbors. And I think India therefore needs to protect itself. And I think we will do whatever is appropriate in order to do this. And I think that's the way we will go forward.
Just to press on that a little bit. So the thinking here is that China will target India's satellites, and that's why China needs an ASAT capability?
I don't think China intends to target Indian satellites. I don't think India intends to target Chinese satellites. But let me put it the other way. Now, why do countries actually create this capability? My opinion is, I mean, an ASAT capability doesn't necessarily mean you're going to destroy another country's satellite. But if you don't have an ASAT capability, your satellites are likely to get destroyed, right? So this is a logic of, you can call it a very stupid logic, but that's how, real politics seems to be played out on the world stage. As a bystander of all this stuff for the last 30 years, I'm appalled at the irrationality of nation states, right? To see some obviously bad things going on and doing, for whatever be the reasons, being unable to do anything about it. But I think that's the real world, and I think at some level we have to cope with that real world, right? We cannot afford to ignore it and believe that everything that is going on is noble, beautiful, and peaceful. I actually grew up in the peaceful regime, and I actually believed it could happen. But the last 20 years or so have kind of made me a cynic about a lot of this stuff. Yeah. I'm sorry, I got a little personal, but that's how we feel about it, yeah.
Thank you. Questions from the audience? Okay. We have one right here. Or back there.
Thank you, sir. I am Kesa from Jamia Millia Islamia. Sir, my question is regarding Chinese capability of jamming the satellites or hiding the satellites. Is it right that China has capability to hide any satellite of India? And what is consequences for the India's aspiration, sir? Second thing, sir, where do you find India regarding the GEANS, Global India Navigation System? Because India has only 7 satellites and it requires 19 more. Where do you find it, sir? My question is for Mr. President, sir.
Chinese have a lot of satellites, but I don't think they have any satellite that is invisible. Okay, all of them are trackable. All of them are reasonably sized so that I don't think there's any ambiguity about the fact that we know. The question is whether we know about all of them, right? And that comes back to the SSA capability. And today morning we were talking a lot about cooperation in SSA. So that's one area where a lot of work has to be done internally in India as well and internationally too. So that's one part. The second question that you talked about was NAVIC, right? See, it depends a lot upon the purpose of the navigation and positioning and timing kind of capability that you want to do. Now, for some applications, what India is talking about as a NAVIC system is adequate. But if you're looking at more, what I call more advanced applications of navigation capabilities, you need more precise navigation. And in order to do that, you might have to emulate, right, the Baidu satellite system that the Chinese are putting up, which consists of about 35 or 36 satellites. Galileo, which he talked about, is also a similar system. The GLONASS system, which the Russians have, is also such a system. And of course, the GPS is the pioneer and maybe the world standard for doing a lot of this. So my point is at some stage, we might have to emulate that if you're really interested. The other option is, of course, to cooperate with somebody and make sure that we get the required level of accuracy that will be needed. For course positioning and fixing, this should be adequate for the immediate short term, but in the longer term, we might have to do more than that. Yeah.
Thank you. Up here in the front. Yeah.
Good afternoon, I'm Rohan from Bellatrix. My question is to Professor Chandrasekhar and Colonel Butt. So, China's growing influence, military influence in space, and enabling Pakistan to have sub-meter resolution, imagery satellites. So how do you see it as a threat to our land-based assets? And when North Korea can get orbital capability to achieve orbit, what is stopping Pakistan, or would this enable Pakistan, this collaboration enable Pakistan also to have an orbital capability? How do you see this coming?
Sir, any kind of a superior capabilities in terms of navigation and surveillance as well as SATCOM will provide any adversary with superior tactical, operational and strategic capabilities. So, none denying that fact, the Indian establishment is also aware about this, and suitable mitigation steps are being taken at various levels, which me being presently a service officer, so I may not be in a position to discuss, but yes, Dr. Chandrasekhar is in a position to discuss about that.
I don't want to bore everybody with the same stuff that you've been talking about, but I mean, the fact that Pakistan can build a satellite that has sub-meter resolution capability, in a sense, you can argue stabilizing. You can argue that. And there's very little anybody can do to prevent any country from doing what it wants to do, especially in the world of today. So the barriers to building satellites with fairly high resolution capabilities, civilian satellites and military satellites have very, very few distinctions. Okay, so I think we should not worry too much about the fact that the Pakistanis have a recon capability over India, just as we have a recon capability over them. So it could actually be stabilizing in a sense of the relationship. So that is one part. I tend to believe North Korea too is it's got its own right and it's got its own priorities to do what it has to do. And so my point is a lot of countries are going to be having a lot of capabilities. If you look at the global order, maybe every country can monitor every other country, and maybe it might actually be stabilizing, right? Especially in the context of what we are talking about. So these are, I think, trends that are going to be logical. And as mature countries, we must be able to deal with the possibilities of cooperation and the threats that they pose in a sensible, mature way, rather than getting worried about a military solution to all the problems that we come across, okay? So just taking them out is not going to be a problem. And let me repeat, China and Pakistan will continue to collaborate, and much of that collaboration will be directed against India. And we have to live with that reality. I don't think we have to go to war with either country in order to live and cope with that reality. Yeah, thank you.
Let's jump on that. I think when we tend to talk national security issues, we look at national capabilities. But let's be honest, the commercial Earth observation sector is growing tremendously. Planet, which is a company that's based in the United States, can image every spot of the world every single day. What's stopping Pakistan or any country from buying that data? Nothing. So I think we tend to, maybe hyper-focus on national capabilities, but the commercial sector has a huge role to play in security and stability. And I'd be curious to know what the panel thinks about that. How do we bring the commercial sector into security discussions? Thoughts? Thank you.
I think Europe is the best example.
Ali, we want to start?
Yeah, definitely Europe has developed on a basis of, I would say, a pretty unique vision of space. Maybe a bit naive to some, but definitely Europe sees space as, I would say, an area or a privileged resource, I would say, to be preserved, and has really developed most of its infrastructure in a civil and business-oriented perspective, which puts Europe a bit aside among the club, I would say, of space powers. But definitely, yes, I'm quite convinced that the economy and the space economy, but also the contribution of space to the economy on Earth is going to become increasingly critical to more and more of the countries, of the nations around the world. And I fully concur to what Victoria just said, that the private sector, what we see is that the private sector is strongly developing everywhere, is now increasingly able to fully handle the deployment of space systems, satellites, even launchers, at least a couple of examples. And this is definitely a game changer. And I believe that this private sector will at some point also have to and will come up with initiatives to more properly handle the security in outer space. And I I expect, maybe I'm a bit naive, but I expect that all the implications for socio-economic development will increasingly weigh in the balance of concerns, and that if historically space has started as a really purely governmental, mostly military-oriented area back in the 60s and 70s. We see now that the trend that I would like maybe to try to highlight today is that the trend is not as an increasing militarization, but I will see it the other way around. That we have a growing role of the civilian, of the commercial activities in space, which actually gradually balances the previous bias that we had in favor of governmental activities. And this is, I would say, a word of hope, that an optimistic vision that I would like to share with you today.
I mean, in terms of bringing the commercial sector into national security, in the UK, space was designated a sector of critical national infrastructure in 2015. So that ensures that those parts of the space sector that are deemed critical are brought into conversations with government, with the Centre for the Protection of National Infrastructure, but also allows for the discussion amongst all of those sectors so they can understand their reliance on space. So I think that sort of model, where by designating them as critical to a part of national security, because in the UK most of these sectors are run by private companies, whether that's the water or the energy. So I think that's quite an interesting model. I think where it gets difficult is when you start to look at what those companies provide. So when you start to think about imaging, and how can you ensure? Is there a way that you can ensure that the images collected by a commercial company are not provided to certain actors you don't want them to? I think that's a much more difficult conversation.
Maybe other questions. One.
Yeah,
Just if it can be, sorry, if it can be succinct, so we have about 5 minutes and a bunch of questions left, so quickly.
Yeah, question to the European Spaces and Mr. Tortora. Two questions. One is, as part of the European space policy, supporting the small, medium enterprises, SMEs, if you could touch upon that and how you are able to do that. Point number one. Point number two, Europe, as an union of so many countries, are able to come up with one collective space policy, and how that can set an example for a global space policy. Two questions.
Well, the first one regarding the small business, yes, Europe might not be the leader there, but nevertheless, I think we rank, I guess, at the moment second behind the United States in terms of number of startups created. And obviously all the European institutions, ESA, European Union, but also individual member states, all of them support this move. However, it is also a reality that the European domestic markets for these companies is not as big as the US market, so this is, I would say, a condition which is less favorable. It is also true that I would say the mode of action of the mode of support that all European governments are implementing is mostly support to innovation. In Europe, we are not likely to interfere when the developments get close to the markets. So this is why the European, I would say, governments or institutions are supporting innovation, which is quite upstream. But when it gets close to the market, then usually they would step back and leave it up to the companies to develop their own proper commercial policies. And and for instance, we don't have some quite interesting instruments that the US have developed, one of them being the anchor tenancy, for instance. This is something which does not exist in Europe because European institutions are too much reservation, I would say, or too maybe overcautious when it gets to interfering with the rules of the competition. But that being said, I'll say we are quite successful. We at SP recently issued a paper on I would say making the status of the latest development of the so-called new space, or space, it's called Space Ventures 2018. So it's available for download from our website, and we'll get a closer view on the details of what's taking place at the moment in Europe. Now, when it comes to your second question, have we really come to a unified European space policy? Probably that, I would say that Europe has invented the concept of a regional space agency with the creation of ESA, and the European Space Agency is basically a very effective tool for pooling resources. And actually it has proven to be very efficient in giving the means to Europe to really develop and come up with a capable and competitive space industry. But this is for the management of programs per se. Now, when it comes to policy, I would say we have a broad picture. We have, I would say, high level, I would say, high level perspectives on which member states have been able to agree, but nothing that really can compare to some other national space policies like the US, like the Chinese, or even the Indian one. It's, I would say, it's in progress. And it takes a while before we are able to converge, even at European level, on a number of issues related to space, but mostly because the most difficult issue to handle is the distribution of industrial capacities, and this, as you can imagine, is the, I would say, the roadblock that we need to further overcome. Now, the key question.
We're getting close to end. Can you?
But and last, and I will conclude with that, is we could even question whether we need one single European space policy. I think that what we need is European space policies. We need one security space policy. We need one commercial space policy. Now, a European space policy per se, overarching and encompassing all the various aspects of space, might not even be useful.
Thank you. We have time for one very succinct question, sir, in the front. Succinct responses, please.
This is a little bit based on historical facts. When the ISS was planned, NASA and US was trying to pressurize to use it for some military purposes, and Japan and Canada objected, and finally USA could not do it. Now the Chinese are having their own space stations. What type of threat perceptions we get from that? How they may use it? Because in ISS, when it was under consideration and construction, the NASA tried to use it for some military purposes in condition that they will give money for that. So yes, the space stations can be used for such purposes. So now that China is doing it and no control for any international collaborations or such things, how it can be a threat perception for us?
Thoughts about China's national security implications for their space station?
Yeah, I see. The first thing I'd like to point out is the Chinese space station is being opened up for collaborative activities. The Chinese have an agreement with the Outer Space Office, the Space Office in the UN. A lot of experiments on the Chinese potential space station are being made available to all the countries of the world so that they can cooperate. So that's the first part of your question. It is going to be open to international collaboration, and the Chinese will open it up for international collaboration also. That's one. Second part is the role of manned space stations in military affairs is kind of hybrid, right? The US has talked about experimenting with it a long back and all that. I tend to believe you don't need a human presence to do most of the stuff that we were talking about. Maybe you can bypass them. But the space station and space-related laboratories, for example, which are there in orbit for a long time, can be used to develop a lot of technical capabilities that are required both for civilian and military purposes. So that's the other part of the story. So my argument overall is I don't think one should qualify it as a predominantly military activity and predominant activity of major concern. I think other activities are much more important. Yeah.
Okay, last thought, Sally.
Just very quickly, I think that and you saw this quite a lot with the media response to the Chinese landing on the far side of the moon, that when they do something in space, we're automatically worried. We're automatically saying, oh gosh, is this going to be something military? Whereas, all the countries, the US, all of them, we do all of it. And I think that we just lose sight a little bit about what the purpose of space is for military, and I think it is about that information side of it. So by just very kind of clearly conceptualizing really what we understand by the military applications of space, we can just be able to understand other activities for what they are without automatically sort of jumping the gun and worrying about military applications.
A note of cautious optimism. Good one to end on. Please join me in thanking the panel for what's been a lively discussion.
Thank you, Victoria. And that brings to a close to the panel on space security. Let's move straight into the next spotlight address. We have Wing Commander Neelu Khatri, and I welcome Daniel Porras to moderate the discussion.